Ether is a hell of a drug is not something you would likely hear someone say in the United States today in the 21st century, or in the second half of the 20th century for that matter. Before that, it had a long run as one of the first reliable anesthetics, which more or less made the types of surgeries we take for granted today possible. In the 19th century, it was also a socially acceptable way to get high at get-togethers, which people called ether frolics. Then, safer and more reliable anesthetics were developed. Social attitudes shifted as the country went through the temperance movement, and the frolics started out in what you might call respectable circles in the beginning, who then started to look down on the practice as the lower classes followed suit. But more than anything else, drugs like marijuana and cocaine became more popular and just replaced it. But even in places where access to other drugs is limited, people aren't generally huffing ether. Its use in Salt's Neck proves to be another reminder that the world where Severance exists is slightly different from ours. When it was announced that the episode title was Sweet Vitriol, viewers made the ether connection as this was one of the first names it was known as when it was first synthesized back in the 16th century. From the show's lore, we knew a young Jame Eagan worked as a stewman at an ether mill before founding Lumon. And as Harmony reminds us in this episode, it's where he met his wife Imogen while she was working as a swab girl. A couple of weeks ago, after episode 6 was released, the family who owns the Chinese restaurant posted some photos of the set decoration, which included a newspaper article about the ether plant in Salt's Neck being sued for allegedly spilling alcohol into the water supply. But that's never addressed directly in the episode. There's an interesting parallel between ether's use as an anesthetic and the way someone like Mark is using the severance process. Both are ways to avoid pain and discomfort. This extends to some of the real-world applications that we saw Gemma enduring on the testing floor, and has led to a lot of theories since that episode came out. They all start off pretty well based on those reveals, and then sort of derail into incoherence when they try to explain what Cold Harbor is, or Lumon's endgame more generally. While I wouldn't say this episode was an achievement in the way the last one was, it was not without its revelations. It was season 2's third and I presume final departure episode, and there was a lot of chatter about the short runtime. Personally, I wasn't that concerned when I realized that was only 3 minutes shorter than the season 1 finale, but watching this I was surprised how slowly things had to develop to hit the cut to black 36 minutes in. If you think about it, this is the only place it fits. And since it's been said that the original plan was to have Gemma's scenes spread out through the season leading up to the reveal, I'm guessing that when they scrapped that idea to give us a really stellar episode 7, that left them with a little less for episode 8. If that's the case, I think they made the right choice. The episode opens with shots of a coastal region, which is quite different from what we're used to seeing around the town of Kier. We still don't know where anything actually takes place geographically inside Severance, but we do know this was filmed in Newfoundland and Labrador, the easternmost province of Canada. The fictional town is Salt's Neck, which you'll remember from the sign in the second episode is 238 miles or kilometers from where Harmony was driving after she left Kier. She looks conflicted but determined as she drives into a town that seems to have seen better days. It appears remote and the buildings are on the small side, which made me think of a fishing village or something along those lines. When she stops in a parking lot to brush her teeth, the first thing we see anyone do there is pull out a small bottle of ether. They put some on a piece of cloth, put it inside a paper bag, and then huff the vapors to get high. They share a quick look, but he keeps going about his business, and she doesn't look surprised to see something like this happening out in the open. After he finishes, he slumps over in his buzz while her phone buzzes at the same time, and we see from the name on the screen that Devin is making the call Ragabi warned her not to make. She doesn't pick up, and this all amounts to her being on a mission she can't be distracted from in a place she wouldn't otherwise return to. She heads to the Drippy Pot Cafe, which is run by a brand new character. We see him pass a bottle of ether to one of his customers as they exchange small talk, and he's topping up everyone's coffee. When Harmony makes her entrance, he recognizes her right away, and the looks they pass indicate they have a history. I grew up in a Rust Belt town, and this all feels pretty familiar. The people who stick around after the jobs move away. And it adds to the world building in that it's the first place we've seen in this reality that isn't Kier, but it's still somewhat consistent since everything here revolves around Lumon. It makes me wonder if we're still in PE, whatever that stands for, because the one thing that really jumped out at me in that prop news article I mentioned earlier was that it still described ether as a commonly used anesthetic. At the end of the day, these aren't questions you can answer yet. And this was the big difference between this one and episode 7 for me. In that, many of the reveals changed the way I thought about what was happening, but I felt like it was shepherding me toward the answers, even if there wasn't enough information to put everything together. The revelations here all made me think I needed to take a beat and see what happens next before I can sort out what's actually going on. It's not necessarily a bad thing since we'll likely get a direct follow-up in episode 9, but there is a notable difference. Harmony remarks that the town is older and frailer than she remembers. Then he responds in a way that seems out of character after we get to know him better, saying, "Yeah, well, with the market readjustment from a few years ago and the fluctuating interest rates, there was a re-entrenchment from some of the core infrastructure investments." That all gets glossed over when she tells him she needs a favor, but she doesn't want to talk there and tells him to meet her at the factory. He leaves right after her, and when they meet outside, you can see that they have a lot of shared memories here. Most of which we'll find out were not good because they're from when they worked there as kids. While Sissy will refer to this as being apprentices later, it's straight up child labor, like working long hours at 8 years old and also using a little ether to make it all a little less terrible. Ultimately, this shared experience gets him past his hangups about helping her. More specifically, the hatred he has for Lumon as a result, since when she brings up any resentments he might have towards her, it's pretty clear he has some. Also, he mentions that Sissy is considered a pariah around town because she still lives by the 9. Referring to Kier's 9 core principles that are similar to Catholicism's 7 virtues. Harmony is convinced that if Lumon is watching Sissy's house, they'll recognize her car. So they load her up in the back of his truck under a tarp before they head there. On the way, she gets another call from Devin that she doesn't answer. In Season 1, everything about Cobel's backstory was mysterious, and we were left guessing about her true motivations. While what we learn about those in this episode is somewhat incomplete, we can piece together the history where her mother's story was always the biggest question due to Harmony having her breathing tube prominently displayed on her shrine to Kier. A stint at the ether mill before the Myrtle Egan School for Girls is an additional layer since before Miss Wong was introduced, the idea of child labor never really came up. I think the general consensus about her mom was that her death was related to the breathing tube itself, or that Harmony was obsessed with reintegration and Mark and Ms. Casey recognizing each other because her mother was somehow in a similar state to Gemma, which up until episode 7 aired, many people thought might have been brain dead. The real story goes back to the ether mill where she was injured in some fashion, either in an accident or just long-term exposure, which would have meant that she would have had to have been working there as a child too, since given the ages, she would have still been very young when she died. We see markings on the wall tracking Harmony's height that stop at age 12, so we can assume she went off to school at around that time. We learn that the core of her resentments is that she wasn't there to take care of her mom, and that she never got to say goodbye because of that. This means that her mother was already sick before she left home, and was likely in her early 30s when she passed. The nature of her condition is never addressed directly, but respiratory issues are a common harmful side effect of working with noxious chemicals. Her young age could hint that there's something else going on, but it never comes up. By the time Harmony arrives at the house, her Aunt Sissy has already had a call from Mr. Drummond. It turns out she's a full-blown zealot and fiercely loyal to Lumon, or perhaps more importantly, the Eagan family. In her upstairs hallway, we get a glimpse of a plaque on the wall that she received for being a quarterly striver during her time working as a youth apprentice matron, aka child laborer coordinator, which explains why Harmony blames her for turning James LaGrosse's character onto ether when Sissy says she doesn't want the huff peddler in her house. And they hold out to make this a reveal at the end, but there we find out his name is Hampton when she finally says it before she leaves. Harmony is looking for something she left there, and when she realizes all the stuff is gone from her room and her mother's room is locked, she has a showdown with her aunt who isn't helpful because of the call from the Eagans. Harmony essentially blames Sissy for her mother's death and earns herself a slap for bringing up that she didn't say anything when her aunt removed the breathing tube. Sissy insists there was gratitude in her eyes after being freed from her suffering, but the real reveal here is that Charlotte Cobel wasn't a believer in Kier's philosophy. She actually hated Lumon, which would have created a rift between the sisters, with Sissy being the one to make the decisions while Harmony's mom was incapacitated. This presents the opportunity to show how deep the dedication of the true believers can go. And there are some interesting comparisons wrapped up in it all because Sissy sees the Eagans as Harmony's way out of the grim situation in Salt's Neck. We see how staying there turned out for Hampton, not that great, but also know that there was a price involved with following the Eagans for Harmony. And even though you probably don't agree with Sissy's assertion that the Eagans are somewhat beyond reproach since the town wouldn't exist without the factory, you can follow her thinking. Salt's Neck is a desperate place. She had high hopes for Harmony after seeing her as one of the hardest working child slaves at the plant, and by saying that he saw Kier in her, Jame Eagan was speaking her aunt's language. Things get even more interesting when she's pressed about what Mr. Drummond said on the phone, and Sissy tells Harmony to go back and plead forgiveness. The Eagans will grant it. When Harmony brings up them showing her mercy like Sissy did to her mother, you realize that she suspects that her aunt may have killed her mother at the Eagans' request. While she doesn't cop to it, she does just sit there rubbing a rock with Kier's face drawn on it at this point, before offering up a different explanation later. It's hard for Harmony to know what to believe, and that makes it harder for us to understand where her head is. She eventually finds the key on the shrine to Kier Sissy has in her room, which is very similar to the one that Harmony keeps in her basement. You see depictions of the Tempers, cards referring to the 9 core principles, and loads of material related to Lumon and Kier. This is something they have in common, and something that I don't think you can overlook when you think about who Harmony is and what she wants. When she opens her mother's room, we see that it was left just as it was when she died decades ago. Part of the reason Sissy didn't want her to open it was that she said it was supposed to stay closed until everyone who knew her sat with Kier. There isn't much decoration, but she does have Harmony's school picture displayed on a shelf, which shows that she had affection for her daughter. Her breathing machine is still next to the bed, and Harmony hooks up the tube, the one that she brought with her from home, and breaks down on her bed before falling asleep. When he can't take the cold anymore, Hampton forces his way in, and that gives us a funny exchange when he says Sissy smells like crow skin, which I don't even know what that means, but it still seems somewhat spot on due to her acidic nature. They talk about Harmony's mom, whose hate for Lumon was enough to make Hampton like her even though he barely knew her. He sits next to Harmony on the bed, where they share a smile before he asks if she wants to get high. This is one of those moments where you realize you never knew much about Cobel outside of work before this episode, because you have no idea how she'd react in this intimate situation. He pulls out his bottle and does his thing, which makes him cough, and it almost sounds like he'll start crying before he starts laughing hysterically. She takes the gear and follows his lead, taking her first hit since she was 8 years old. He jokingly asks if she's ready to man the vat for 10 hours, and she tells him it's shameful that he sells the ether to other people. It comes down to them both playing the hands they were dealt after having all their agency stripped away from them at such a young age. And in the moment, he decides just to move closer. After a pause, she leans in and they kiss. When Sissy starts shouting they need to leave, Harmony gets an idea and heads to the root cellar. There she finds some of her things, including a yearbook from her time at the Myrtle Egan School for Girls. We see that she was the class valedictorian, and the blurb under that is a little hard to read, but you can see that she was the captain of the field hockey team and president of the Goat Husbandry Club. And overall, just a really good student. On the next page, you see the man himself awarded her the Jame Eagan Wintertide Fellowship at a special ceremony. She looks in a different crate and finds that award, which is a bust of his head, and a notebook she hid inside, which is what she was looking for. She goes back in to tell Sissy she's leaving and asks her not to tell the Eagans she was there, which obviously isn't happening because of the aforementioned zealotry. When Harmony insists she owes them no loyalty because Lumon destroyed the town, she responds with there would be no town if it wasn't for the factory statement I mentioned earlier. She brings up Harmony's job, saying everything she has is because of the Eagans, and that should earn them her fealty. Of course, she doesn't know about the notebook, and that turns out to be a big deal because it reveals that Harmony invented the Severance chip. She has the initial sketches, base code, and even name drops the overtime contingency plan and the Glasgow block. It's all right there. At first, Sissy claims Jame Eagan was the inventor, which is the company line. But when she puts on her glasses to look, she has to admit that it was Harmony's idea. There's no doubt about it. In an episode of a different show, I would say that this recontextualizes what we thought we knew, but it literally changes everything in this story. After coming from a chaotic situation where she had next to nothing, really only her connection to her mother and her love, she gave that up for an opportunity where she excelled in this messed up high control situation that you can imagine would have its appeals to someone in her shoes, only to have it all ripped away so the guy running things could take the credit. So why did she never tell anyone then? They told her that Kier's knowledge is for all, and if she sought credit, she'd be banished, which again, what would you expect a teenager to do in that situation? Based on what a big deal this is, Sissy tries to throw the evidence into the wood-burning stove we'd seen her loading logs into, but Harmony manages to wrestle it back from her. She leaves saying she hopes Sissy dies as painfully as her mother did, and then her aunt drops her final bomb telling Harmony that Charlotte removed the tube herself, that her mother was a coward who was more sick in the soul than in the body. She was filled with malice and resentment. Harmony doesn't believe this, and overall, it's a bit hard to tell which story is true. Sissy continues to pile on saying that she's no good just like her mother was, but then someone starts to approach the house on the road and she has to leave. This push and pull highlights how complicated this is for Cobel. She went to the school looking for something and appears to have found it. It's hard to imagine this from the outside looking in, but I think her latching on to the Kier philosophy to become a true believer makes sense. That would naturally create a lot of dissonance because it's kind of batshit, and I think she would manage that by looking at Jame Eagan and the people who were currently in charge as the real problem. There's no question they wronged her, so turning her frustration towards them allows the core philosophy to still be correct. They're simply misapplying things if you know how that goes. There are things here that show that her mind might be able to change, that she might be on her way towards changing. Seeing the way the town looks after all these years and seeing how twisted her aunt sounds. But belief systems aren't that easy to change, and from everything I've read about it, it's a process that takes time. Hampton lets her take his truck to make her getaway. We see him step out into the road as another vehicle approaches, and he says, "Try to tame these tempers, assholes." As a recapper, it was kind of driving me nuts that no one would say his name throughout the episode, but the late reveal makes sense because it highlights how she's been conditioned to deal with the world outside of Lumon. Even with their history, it was like she couldn't see him as something more than something she could use to enact her plan until the very end. Even in the early part of the episode where she got a little sweet on him, she did so by bringing up Kier and Imogen, which gave him the opportunity to earn a laugh by asking if she was hacking up a lung at the time. And honestly, he comes in handy like that throughout the episode because it's one that really needed it. As she drives off with the cult's firewoman playing in the background, she sees that Devin is calling again and answers it this time. She starts by saying that Mark's been reintegrating. Harmony brings up Ragabi, who Devin confirms was involved, and Cobel seems surprised she hasn't killed Mark yet. Devin says he seemed okay since he woke up, but they want to try something different, which I think alludes to the idea of possibly talking to Izini at the birthing cabin, which she brought up last week. She has her put Mark on the phone, and the episode ends with her saying, "Tell me everything." With the music cue and her speeding away from Salt's neck, it gives you one of those, hell yeah, the team's back together, it's time to burn Lumon to the ground feelings. But when you think about it, Harmony Cobel was never part of the team. In fact, she was one of season 1's primary antagonists. And she's a brainwashed true believer in something that spoke to her when she was introduced to it as a vulnerable child. There was always a sense that she might have different ideas about how things were run, and we know exactly what was going on there after this episode. But I don't think that adds up to knowing what she'll do next. I'd be pretty surprised if she just flipped to the other side after getting evidence that she could use to leverage her way back in, especially if that involves knocking the people who are in charge down a notch. It makes you wonder if Helena or anyone else in the inner circle even knows that Jame isn't Severance's inventor. It doesn't seem likely that would be something he would go around telling people. The show continued their streak of casting the right actors for these appearances that might turn out to be for just one episode, and then we'll never see them again. Jane Alexander and James LaGrosse both delivered performances that made these characters memorable. We see the effect Lumon has on the world outside, soaking up the best and brightest like Harmony and leaving the rest to rot while they move on. We see the price Harmony paid for being plucked away, having to grow up amidst the indoctrination at the Eagan schools, but also see the price she would have had to pay if she stayed behind to live with Sissy. In a way, that character had to be almost worse than the alternative so that we could side with Harmony a little bit, because she is an agent of Lumon. But even as someone who became a true believer and did plenty of terrible things in the company's name, no kid should have gone through the things she did. So as already mentioned, things are complicated now. Mark and Devin might inadvertently be offering her more sensitive information she could use to work her way back in and finally get the recognition she indeed feels she deserves. Or this might be the beginning of a full turn away from Lumon, which is probably where things are ultimately headed. There's a lot of space for some interesting stuff to happen between those two options. It seemed kind of crazy that she was detached from the story for so long this season, but it looks like Harmony Cobel, the inventor of the Severance process, is back and will play an important part going forward, which, why did she do that again? Why did she create Severance? Does it feel like all of this adds up to developing this piece of technology? We'll have to wait and see, and I think that's a great place to leave things. We'll be live again Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for a longer discussion about Sweet Vitriol, so make sure you join us and bring your questions. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.